And I consider myself a very organized person. So if you look at my desktop, you would see that there's just a few files, some folders, and some screenshots around there. And there are things that I look at from time to time, from example, screenshots that I forget to delete after using them. But among those screenshots, there is a very special screenshot which you can sell as an NFT, which I don't care for. But this screenshot is one I took in 2019 from an answer in Stack Overflow. And it says this: HTML5 specifies a hash chain event. This event is now supported by all modern browsers. And the list of browsers is Internet Explorer 8. There are not libraries that support this. Firefox 3.6, Chrome 5. And if I'm not mistaken, they are about to reach version 100, Safari 5, which is very old, and Opera 10. And these two key points are very important here, because the hash chain event is almost not used at all. We don't need to use it. We have other things to use. And when we check the list of modern browsers, we see that we are very far away. And we are not so far away when we check the date. It's 2009. Is March 2009. And March was the month in which Internet Explorer 8 replaced officially Internet Explorer 7. So there was the version 8, but it was not distributed with Windows. And if you ask, what was the original question? Well, the original question said, how do you react to hash change in the URL? And effectively, hash change is an answer that most developers would answer nowadays. But to think that 12 years back, we were already fighting browsers to make them work and begging them, praying so that people would change their browser so that we can use new APIs. And this is something that existed 12 years ago. But when we think about today, a hash change, we don't even ask if this is supported by the browser when we develop an application, because we know that every browser supports them. And this is something that gives me hope, that there is a hope for change for the better, and that the change comes earlier than anticipated. And I would like to go 1 year back, 2008. At that time, the only way to make a single page application is using a hash-based routing, which gives us a URL based with a hash. And you can use frameworks such as MooTools, which is the system that was at the time that managed those interactions. And that was then. Nowadays, we can use a routing based in hash, but we can use a routing based in APIs. And we can use as well a lot of frameworks such as Router, React Router, Angular, that's the blue icon there, and a lot of routers. And they allow us to have a URL that looks like a classic URL, and it gives you full control. But if we think about 2008, that was not possible. You had to use the hash. And nowadays, the only way to make that change was on a hash change. But at that time, Internet Explorer was not what was considered a browser, but at that time, it was the default browser. Everyone thought of it as a browser. So if we look at the user distribution in all browsers in 2008, the only version of Internet Explorer that supported the hash change was Internet Explorer 8. 6 and 7 did not support this. And I would like to think for a moment, what was the percentage of users in 2018 8 that was using Internet Explorer 8. And perhaps you would think that it's 1%, but it is not even 0.5%. The most impressive thing is that Internet Explorer 6 and 7 together were 70% of Internet users. So 7 out of 10 users were using a browser that did not support the hash change. So you wondered how MooTools could support that, how MooTools could do this for their users. And the answer, well, you wouldn't like it. But it was a technique called Poly, which ran some code after a few seconds to recover a value. So the code that is showing in your screen was the same. It's a set interval of 200 milliseconds that is going to look at location.hash compared with the version that you have stored in the variable. And if it changes, it will generate some browsing from our side so that everything is up to date as it should be. And maybe you would think that this is outrageous, this code, but I will tell you, I am not exaggerating. You can check the old code in MooTools, you can check the commits, and you will see this little piece of code with some bit more, but you will check a set interval with a very short time interval. And nowadays, hash change exists everywhere in all browsers, but we don't even have to use it in a routing code. So this is something that I have experienced, and I would like to talk to you about the past, the present, and the future of front-end routing. So, well, I've told you about the past, and it's not the most interesting thing, but it's fun to talk about. And before talking about what comes next, I would like to talk to you about the concept of a router. That's the piece of code that you use between the URL that gives us access to an API so that we can read or write. But really, the router can be divided in submodules, which can be more complex. For example, most routers are based on a module called history. That's a module that must interact with the URL. And why does this module exist? Because not all browsers are going to equally manage this history. But it's not only that, we also have a matcher, which extracts the parameters in the URL to parse some part of the URL after adding these URL patterns in regex and etc. And depending on what we're using in the front end, we are using also components. For example, link view in the case of React. And I am not going to talk about components because it's not that specific, but the part of history and matcher, this is something we can talk about today. And we're going to talk about what will come in the future in JavaScript. So the history of API is something that exists in every browser. It exists everywhere except in Internet Explorer 9, but nobody uses it nowadays. Even other versions support it. And consists in two methods, one event and a few properties. We have this global object history with two functions that in the same form, one is called push state and the second is replace state. The first argument we can keep in history and the second argument is called title and you can ignore it because it's useless. And the third is the variable that we have to change. And as you can see, this is problematic. We have not used two functions that use the same and have a different parameters instead of two functions, so that's wrong. And we also have an event pop state that instead of being attached to the object history, it's attached to the object window, and we don't know why. And we also have the state of history, that's the data object that we can push, and the length that gives us the number of entries that there are in the history. And we can no longer not inspect anything else. And to recap very fast, how does it work? So we start in movies.com. And if we look at the history.state is null, we just enter the page and the history length is 1. If we do a push state in the second argument, we just have an empty string because it doesn't do anything. The URL is going to change and it is going to increase the length to 2. And if we do a second push with another state and another URL, the URL is going to change, the state is going to change, the length is going to change. And we can also go back with the browser button, which is going to change the URL because everybody will experience that. This is what we do in every application, every website, and the status will change. But the history length will be the same because we have 3 entries in history. But besides that, we can't inspect anything. We can just look at the status in the history, in the current history, but not the next or the one in the back. And we can go forward. In the URL is going to change again, but the history length will remain the same. And the problem of this API is going further than what we can do with it. This is a point of design in the API. The way in which we interact with the URL exists from a long time ago. The URL is divided in several sections. We have the path or the path name, we have the query or the search, and we have the hash or the fragment. And the gray part, which I do not talk about, is the domain. And that is the premium part of the URL because it is the only one that you have to pay to change. But all the rest you can change. Everything else you can change. And you can read and change from the same property, which is the location. That is a global object that gives us access to a path name, to search, and gives us access to search. That will give us that interrogation point, that genre horror page 1, and the hash, that is the hashtag reference. And that you can access as a single string of characters. But not only you can read them using location.pathname or location.search or href, you can also write them, you can also change them. And when they are changed, we are going to create some navigation. We are going to click in a link. And this is no longer possible with the push state because we will need to use it so that this stays in the same page. So this new API exists from a long time ago, history API, but this limits us the way we use JavaScript. It has a use that is absolutely correct. Before this API, it is no longer considered correct in CPA, which is problematic. But that's not the only problem, because if we have a link, a regular link with href, we can't use it because clicking is going to reload the page. So depending on what we're using, we would use a link, a router link, or whatever, which is going to call the push state or whatever. And this is a little bit problematic because we do not only lose that way of navigating that exists from a long time ago, but we also lose the native functions in the browser. For example, the scroll behavior, which is going to find the page at some level if we go forward or go back. And all of that is lost, and the routers have to re-implement that feature so that it works. And this gives us the present of the routing. History API is the only good choice there is, and it is very strange that a person has had not a problem using it. But this should change with the new API, which is the AppHistory API. This is a proposal. This is something that is not implemented by any browser yet. But the The point is that we would like to correct all these problems that already exist with History API and to add a lot of improvements to routers, not only for developers but to users, and consists in the function navigate, which is the combination of this push. There is no longer this argument title that is useless. We have state, info, and replace. Info is a new property, would be like a transient state. And we have an event, several events. We have this navigate, that's the equivalent of pop state that is added to app history. And this event is going to be a lot more flexible, which finally takes away the problem of the pop state is not in Internet Explorer, is not going to be executed in a hash change or in a manual change of the URL, which is not consistent in browsers, and that's impossible to do. It's impossible to manage all the use cases that there are. And more interestingly, the history is going to give us access not only to the state of an entry, but to all entries and to a lot of features, that a lot of functions that will let us access and change the state. So we're going to begin entering in this API. We'll begin with the function navigate. This looks like changing the href from location more than a push name, because this function, what it does is to completely navigate. It's going to change the state and everything, but if we use an URL, any URL, it is going to go to that URL. So it runs a full browsing and it looks more like a location href. So in a push state, you can change the domain. This has advantages because it's going to scroll the hash, the fragments, which push name doesn't do. And you can go to cross document to another domain. It returns a promise, and we will see about that later. But you can see when the navigation has ended, and that allows the browser to update the loading bar. So the interface of the browser is going to be better, a better experience for the user that looks more like classic application when you send a request to a server, but without having to reload the page completely. So those are the advantage of this. And it updates the URL immediately. This may look stupid, but not every browser update the URL in the same way when we do a push state. And this may look silly, but from the point of view of a router, to be able to provide an experience, an ideal experience to any browser in any user, this complicates stuff for us a bit. But this is also reversible, which means that it's very easy to cancel or revert navigation after it has occurred. And I am going to explain this later. Let's see a practical example of this. For example, we will go to a project's URL. We can see a state here, which is a list of projects. I would recommend that the state and the history
And also we have that state that has to do with the browser. For example, here, there is something that we can do. And then we can have that information in the model service. And again, if the person says that they don't want to navigate, well, that's it. So I have just changed location.date. But what is important is at event listener. With this, we can access with a lot of information. What is important is that this is happening not only with that history point navigate, but also with past name query, and even though with a click in a link. And with that, we have access. Well, let's see. I will focus only in one of 5 of them. The one that can allow us to cancel transmission while, that allowed us to have this promise and to the browser and to define the time of this navigation to recover data. Also, we have destination, also the information that I already explained, and one signal. Let's see an example of this. If we want, for example, to cancel any browser in any document, we can check in the event.destination, same document. And then if we do a navigate, we can recover this promise. And with this promise, when we have this event, we can know this error. However, if we use a transmission while, we can go to any promise, and in that way, this will be resolved, and then we can have anything. But what is important here in these both cases is that it doesn't matter what happened as a problem, if it's resolved or it fails, but just when we call navigate, this URL is there. And this is very consistent. And this is very useful. This also means that if the browser does not happen, if there's some error, if there is a failure, we have a catch in this promise, but location also will help. But it's very easy to change. Let's look at a current or real example. Well, when we recover the information and then our router extracts the page and then the new one, and then the browser is there. And once everything is working, we stop that. The browser will stop doing the spinner and everything will work out. We can change this code if we want it with a synchronous function, EF asynchronous. So if we do all this, any browser with a link, location, or .navigate, we will have this path. And what is interesting is we can have this event.signal. And if the browser is canceled for any reason, this will be canceled too. The browser will cancel by itself. But also we can have this global effect. For example, catch an event. The other one, it was inside navigation, outside navigation, and an error. And also we can have several listeners. And with this, we can add to each event several promises. It can be different, and all these promises can be combined in just one transition with all this code, and we can have a more flexible access with a combination of all the promises that has been added by the router, but also for the file. For example, if we have several routers with this, it's very easy to a developer to add their own transition while with an event of navigate, and a writer, because it will be depending with this API. This can have this promise can be integrated in this browser. And this transition has more information, has the class or the type, navigation type, with a back, indirect relation, also the front. And we have the finish is a little bit as catch and end, and navigate success that we already seen, and this very important or interesting function options. And I love this because we can say AppHistory.transition.rollback, and that's it. We are in the other page without any problem. To implement this day by day from the point of view of a router, it's not so evident. It's not work in every cases. To have a function to allow us to do this directly is an incredible characteristic. Also, each entry in the front, each history entry has a couple of information, not only event target, some other events that I think they are pretty interesting, but also we have a key, ID, URL, index, and same document. And I want to highlight or to focus in the key and ID. This property, both of them are UIDs that are created by the browser, and they differentiate in something very concrete. The first one is the state of the entry. It's like an ID, like a hash of the snapshot. We authorize the state of the entry. However, the key is specific to the entry in SI. It's like a pointer, a very concrete pointer to the entry in the history, and will never change, will be the same. This means that we have this API that we can go to any enter anytime, anywhere. And currently is the only API that exists is history.go. And this function and has this parameter or this delta, positive or negative, and then is 1, 2 entries in the back or in the front. And this means that we need that in the router or the user code, there are some routers. We need to save in some way the position of each entry and to calculate at any moment how we are going forward, how many entries we need to go back or to the front. But the problem is this API doesn't work like that because there are some relations that we cannot detect. We need to connect and say there is a browser, and I know that my delta is +1, -1. There are other browsers. They're not allowing us this browser, and we need to add one more. And I would like to show you a very practical example why this API is pretty interesting. So let's imagine that this parallel world where you can go back. There is a bad news and a good news in this parallel world. So, for example, the COVID-19 is still existing, but the good one, there is no history at end. But you know that the COVID is going to happen in 2020, and you say, well, I would like to be like a nomad in 2018. So in 2099, I will be in a very quiet and peaceful place while this is happening. And as a nomad, you start looking or searching or a place. There you can do kayak. And also you go to different cities through America or through Europe or Africa. And you are looking for several cities. And you check out your budget, maybe Beijing, Chechong, or maybe Indonesia, Vietnam. And then you say, no, this is too expensive. I will change and I go back. And if you want to see in the middle of that browser or that navigation in Indonesia, probably if you want to do that today, or I don't know, in that back key, when I use it, most of the time, I lose the information. Maybe the prices are higher due to the cookies. So if I'm doing like a reservation or a booking, it's different. But with this, it's so easy to implement it. And from the browser point of view, it's just a route back to the entry that is linked what you were looking. And then you have this, you can do a click. And in each click, there is a apphistory.go-to. And you will not lose the history. So there's no reason to not implement it. So there are sometimes that if this, maybe there are some web pages, it's kind of hard doing it to have this very good history. So you can go back without losing the state of the form or what you were doing. So these entries in Target, we can have this, the navigation. We also can inspect any entry in the history. And it's because the app history concentrates in the page that we are in. So this means that this is not going to, can be observed with the navigate. And this is useful because we are not, well, currently we have some problems doing this, but every entry of history in the history is an end target, and we can listen. We can put a listener when we go from that entry to the another one, and this is with a navigator.from. So that means that when we are there and we have a link or backward or forward, and we go to another page, it will be do this executing this listener. So in this case, we can update that state, and we can save the cache, and we can reuse that cache and show all the results, even if we do a new request. And all of this, we know that is a front end is there. So any framework can implement it. But Navigate front is not only the event. We have Navigate to, and we have finished result, and it's kind of more complicated is when you don't use an entry. For example, if you go backwards to the history and then we have that browser or navigation, we cannot access anymore. But there are complex cases. So what is interesting is Navigate front and to. And also with navigation guards, the transition while it can be like any router, for example. Navigate front and navigate to is like a navigation guard, but very specific to an entry in the history. It's not like URL or a route. It's very specific to just here in this page with this result, with this status. And if we summarize this API history API for the authors, it's very consistent, predictable, and extensible, and without workarounds. And it's not the case like push state. And an example, well, it's more like a story. If we have a push state or replace it in 100 times in a very short period of time, this will fail. And why this is a problem? Because if you do this and you navigate very fast, you don't want that the speed will be the same. And if there are more than 100 in a very short time, you will not have this navigation function. So this is theory. But for developers, the routers are lighter. There are less bugs. There is a better integration with micro frontends, and they are extensible. But this possibility is the consistency of the API. With these extensibles, this allowed you to have micro front ends and to share, to be more integrated or better integrated. So today, these routers is kind of delicate and not to collision. So for when can we have this API? Well, there's no date. I don't think there is like a hope for to have a specific date, but what is true that we are waiting for the feedback. Also, already we have a experimental polyfill with this real navigation, and it can be fun. And I think it cannot support all the cases of history because there are some parts of the API that cannot be used with this. But this is something, this important and potent part is there. And as I told you, this is an experimental polyfill. So maybe your next question is, all this is very good, but I want to use something. So today, what you can use is this one, History API. I already explained it, but we have another APIs, URLPATTERN, URL, and URL search params. These two in specific allowed us to have this new URL, to change it, but respecting the code. The problem is that recently that was not used because they are not well supported. So this means not all the browsers can use it. And you can imagine the ones, Safari, for example, they have encoding errors in some APIs, and Internet Explorer directly, well, never implemented. It doesn't exist. So if you want to use those APIs that are very useful with Internet Explorer, you need a polyfill. Exists, but and some advantages of this API are the encoding. This topic is not so complicated. There are some characters that you can have in the URL and others that you can't have it. So if you want to write like this, is a very particular writing. And there are very precise ways. For example, there are some that you cannot print it. There are others that are not ASCII, and the percentage character is the same with encoding. But what is funny is every part of the URL has specific rules. In hash, like this one. In path, also, you need the hash, the question mark, using by the query, and the polyraces that was reserved just in case. And in the query part, you have the same, but if you take out this, you write the hash and those symbols, and that's for the query. And all these, that if we compare the browsers, the location that hash, and this is not correct, we will have a very particular result. In Safari, we have this URL with this space. In Firefox, the result is hash, is very good. And the URL, you can read it. It's perfect for the user. But in Chrome, it's codified. It's not okay. But the URL, some things work and other not. And Internet Explorer is very similar. And then if we have it in a correct version with a query, we have in Safari, this is normal, and the URL looks like this. Firefox, the same behavior as the other, and the Chrome is the same. And Internet Explorer is the same. We will have this result. So the behavior in Safari, well, we can think about it. is kind of weird. In Firefox and Chrome, they behave a perfect, and Internet Explorer is the same for it. There are some things that are not updated. So ideally, this behavior in Firefox and Chrome is the one that we can see in the browsers. And also, we have another API that is interesting, and we can use it. And I want to talk about this. Maybe you've seen this in some Express examples and others. And particularly, I want to highlight the users and 2 points name. And this is as a pattern or pattern that match. And this means we have an object that is able to match any type of URL. For example, user/Jackie, that this section before users can be customized. And this will work any other thing. How does this work? This behavior works changing or transforming these strings in this other example. Home will become home. That name is a regular group expression, that anything that is not a slash. And then if we have a regular expression, customized regular expression, it would be that specific character several times. But when we use a matcher in this way, and then we have this route, so the router need to check out this route in the same order. So we go to the US research, first is home, then the next one, and say, this is working. But what we wanted was the last one. So how do we resolve this problem? There are several ways to do it nowadays, and to associate punctuation to any route. The highest is in the list is the first one. If we use this type of score, user research will be the first one. I don't know what do I have, Movies New, but this will be the first one to have this match in this list. All of this exists nowadays thanks to this URL pattern, that this allowed us to add pattern in all the section of the URL. So right now I was reviewing the path, the hash, the query, and then we can use it as something like exec with this code, and then we can see in the match the different groups that we already have. We have an input, is the path name, and then groups with different names. And if we execute with this other route, we will have this exec. But what is good of this, or this is already implemented in Chrome, NGN, it's working. Is not implemented in Firefox or Safari. I do not recommend it, but if we say, well, if we remember what I said at the beginning of my chat, this gives me hope. With all these new possibilities, or we can implement it sooner or later. And with this, I hope that you learned something with this presentation about the routing of front end and what is expecting us in the future, and to know how to be an author of the library. Thank you.